The bond didn't snap. It screamed. Standing in the center of the great stone ring, I didn't look like a woman about to be exiled. I looked like the wolf who had won Mordred his crown. My mistake was simple. I prioritized the lives of our scouts over the expansion of his borders. In the Flint Stone Pack, mercy is a mutation, and Mordred is the cure. He thinks he's stripping me of my rank, my home, and my dignity. He thinks I'm leaving this mountain with nothing. He's wrong. I'm carrying the only thing he ever truly wanted, and I'll be damned if he ever gets his hands on his heir. The hunt starts now.
Welcome to Z's Romance. Before we dive into today's pulse-pounding story of betrayal and survival, I want to hear from you. Our pack is global, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. So head down to the comments right now and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Now, settle in. The hunt is about to begin.
You could have just told me you hated my cooking, Mordred. This seems a bit dramatic, don't you think? I stood in the center of the flint stone courtyard, my knees refusing to buckle, even as the weight of 50 dominant alphas pressed down on my shoulders. My hands were bound with rough hemp, not because I couldn't break them, but because I wanted everyone to see exactly how much effort it took for Mordred to feel powerful. Mordred stepped into my personal space, the scent of cedar and cold iron rolling off him. He looked every bit the high alpha of the northern peaks, his chest scarred from the very battles I'd led him through. His eyes, usually a storm of heat when we were alone in the fur-lined pits of his chambers, were now as flat as a dead man's. "You disobeyed a direct order, Kestra," he said, his voice a low vibration that usually made my toes curl. Today, it just made my skin crawl. "I saved 12 of our brothers from a landslide, Mordred. I figured since we're werewolves and not mountain goats, we might value lives over a few yards of frozen dirt." I gave him a sharp, bloody grin. But hey, maybe I missed the meeting where we decided rocks were more important than warriors. A ripple of suppressed snickers went through the ranks behind us. Mordred didn't find it funny. He reached out, his thick fingers gripping my jaw with enough pressure to bruise. For a second, the old pull was there, that magnetic, carnal heat that had kept us tangled together for 3 winters. It was a physical ache, a hunger that defied logic. "The bond is a weakness, and you, Kestra, are a liability." He didn't use a knife. He didn't need one. He reached for the mate thread, that invisible, raw connection of soul and skin that anchored us. With a roar of pure physical exertion, he slammed his mental weight against it. It felt like someone had reached into my chest and tried to turn my heart inside out. The agony was a white-hot flash, a brutal, physical tearing of nerves and muscle. I gasped, my lungs seizing as the warmth of him vanished from my mind, replaced by a cold, hollow void that felt like a winter grave. I stumbled back, the breath hitching in my throat. I didn't cry. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a single tear. "You are rejected," Mordred announced, his voice booming across the stone. "You are packless. You have 1 hour to reach the tree line before the hunt begins. Any wolf who aids you shares your fate." I straightened my spine, ignoring the way my womb suddenly cramped, a sharp, alarming tug I'd been feeling since the moon turned. 1 hour? You're getting slow in your old age, Mordred. I only need 20 minutes to outrun these pups you call trackers. I turned on my heel, the hemp rope snapping as I flexed my wrists. I felt the eyes of the pack on me, some pitying, some hungry. I didn't care. I needed to move. Every step away from the great stone ring felt like dragging my soul over broken glass, the rejection sickness already starting to bile up in my throat. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, the wind shifted. A new scent hit me, dark, earthy, and dangerously alluring.
It wasn't one of Mordred's men. It was something wilder. I hit the tree line at a dead run, my boots thudding against the frozen earth. My heart was a frantic drum, but it wasn't just fear. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that my body wasn't just fighting the rejection, it was protecting something. A snap of a branch to my left made me skidding to a halt. A massive shadow detached itself from a towering pine. Going somewhere, little wolf?
Chapter 2. The Predator's Debt. The man standing in the shadows wasn't a wolf of the Iron Claw. He was broader, his shoulders spanning the width of the ancient pine he leaned against, and his scent, heavy with damp earth, musk, and wood smoke, didn't carry the stench of Mordred's stagnant authority. He was an outcast, a ghost of the fringes. Torin, I breathed, my hand going instinctively to the small, concealed blade at my hip before I remembered my promise of pure physical defiance. I dropped my hand, balling it into a fist. You're off your usual turf, looking to collect the bounty Mordred hasn't even posted yet? I don't hunt for men who trade their mates for dirt, Torin said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in my chest. He stepped into the sliver of fading light. His face was a map of survival. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, and his eyes were the color of flint. You're running like a wounded doe, Kestra. It's beneath you. I'm not running, I'm tactical retreating with style, I snapped, though a sudden, sharp cramp in my abdomen made my knees wobble. I caught myself against a trunk, my fingers digging into the rough bark. The rejection sickness was hitting hard now. Without the Alpha's bond to anchor my wolf, my inner beast was trying to claw its way out of my skin. I've got 45 minutes before the honor of the pack comes screaming after me. Torin moved. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. He moved with a predatory grace that made Mordred look like a clumsy pup. Before I could blink, he was in my space, his heat radiating off him like a furnace. He didn't grab me. He simply stood close enough that I could feel the thrum of his heartbeat. You smell of copper and salt, he murmured, his head tilting as he caught my scent. And something else. Something new. My heart hammered against my ribs. It's called sweat, Torin. Try it sometime. He didn't laugh. His flinty eyes dropped to my stomach, then back to my face. The realization that hit him was visible in the way his jaw tightened. He knew. In the wilderness, where senses were honed by survival rather than ceremony, there was no hiding the scent of a new life beginning. He doesn't know, Torin stated. It wasn't a question. And he won't. I'd rather raise this pup in a den of bears than let Mordred turn it into another one of his tin soldiers. I pushed off the tree, trying to ignore the way the world tilted. Move, Torin. I need to reach the dead peaks before the moon is high. You won't make the first ridge, he said, stepping into my path again. The wind is turning. Mordred's lead trackers are already circling the eastern pass. They aren't waiting for the hour to be up. They want blood before the sun sets. Then I'll give it to them. I tried to brush past him, but a sudden, violent wave of vertigo washed over me. The ground rushed up to meet me, but I never hit the frost. Torin's arms were like iron bands, catching me before I could collapse. Being held by him wasn't like being held by Mordred. There was no demand for submission, just a terrifyingly solid strength. Let go, I hissed, even as I leaned into his warmth. The hunt is already behind us, Kestra, he whispered into my ear, his breath hot against my cold skin. And I'm the only one who knows the paths they're too afraid to tread. You want to save that life inside you? Then you stop fighting me and start fighting the mountain. From the distance, the first long, mournful howl of the flint stone trackers split the air. They were early, and they were close. Chapter 3. The Frozen Veil. They cheated, I spat, my breath coming in ragged plumes of white as Torin hauled me up a near-vertical rock face. Mordred gave his word, an hour's grace. Mordred gave a speech, Torin countered, his large hand effortlessly hoisting my weight upward. His trackers give results. You taught them too well, Kestra. They know you're fastest on the flats, so they've cut the valleys off. My lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. The rejection was more than an emotional blow. It was a physical leeching of my strength. My wolf was pacing in the back of my mind, confused and mourning, making every muscle in my body ache with a phantom cold. But every time I felt like collapsing, Torin was there, a constant grounding presence. He didn't offer soft words. He offered his shoulder, his back, and his heat. "Why are you doing this?" I panted, as we crested a ridge that overlooked a churning, ice-choked river. "You owe me nothing. In fact, the last time we met, I nearly took your ear off for trespassing." Torin glanced back at me, a ghost of a smirk tugging at his scarred mouth. "You missed. That earns my respect. Most people don't get a second chance to miss with me." He led me into a narrow crevice between two towering slabs of granite. It was so tight, our chests brushed as we navigated the passage. The proximity was overwhelming. The scent of him, primal, masculine, and strangely comforting, began to drown out the lingering, bitter ash of Mordred's bond. My body, in its desperate state of survival, was already trying to find a new anchor. "In here," he commanded, pulling me into a low-hanging cavern hidden by a curtain of frozen ivy. The interior was small, dry, and smelled of cedar boughs. It was a secondary den, a place for a wolf to hide when the world turned hostile. I collapsed onto a bed of dry moss, my body finally demanding the debt I owed it. The cramps in my stomach flared again, sharper this time. I curled into a ball, my hand instinctively shielding my midsection. Kestra. Torin was on his knees beside me. He didn't touch me at first, his hands hovering as if waiting for permission. "I'm fine," I lied, my teeth chattering. I just need to catch my breath." "You're freezing. The rejection is shutting your fever down." He didn't wait for an invite this time. He moved behind me, pulling my back against his massive chest and wrapping his heavy fur-lined cloak around both of us. The heat was instantaneous. It was like being dipped in a warm spring. I should have fought him. I should have been the fierce commander who needed no one. But the cold was a killer, and the life inside me needed the warmth. I let out a long, shuddering breath, my head falling back against his shoulder. "If you tell anyone I huddled with you like a lost pup, I'll kill you," I muttered, the darkness of the cave pressing in. "I have no one to tell, Kestra. I'm a ghost, remember?" His arms tightened around me, his heartbeat a slow, steady rhythm against my spine. We sat in the silence for what felt like hours, two outcasts in the dark. The intimacy was raw, born of necessity and the shared pulse of survival. But the peace was a lie. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the stone floor of the cave. It wasn't Torin, and it wasn't a wolf. It was the sound of a heavy, iron-shod boot stepping on the frozen ivy outside. "Kestra." A familiar, slick voice drifted into the cave. It was Jace, Mordred's lead tracker. "I know you're in there. I can smell your fear and something sweet, something that smells like a very expensive mistake." Chapter 4. The Price of the Pack. Torin was on his feet before the voice finished the sentence, his body shielding mine in the cramped space. He didn't growl, he was silent, a shadow ready to strike. My own blood was roaring in my ears, the adrenaline finally overriding the exhaustion. I stood up, my legs shaky but holding, and pulled a heavy stone-headed mace from Torin's weapon rack. Jace was always a better tracker than a fighter. He'll have at least 3 others with him. They'll be circling for the secondary exit. "There is no secondary exit," Torin said, his eyes fixed on the curtain of ivy. "Then we make one." I stepped out from behind him, my pride burning brighter than the pain. I pushed through the ivy, the sub-zero air hitting my face like a slap. Jace stood 10 feet away, flanked by 2 massive enforcers. They weren't in wolf form. Mordred wanted me to see their faces. He wanted me to know exactly who was betraying me. "Look at you," Jace sneered, his eyes raking over my disheveled hair and the way I held my stomach. The great commander, hiding in a hole with a scavenger. Mordred was right. You've gone soft. Soft? I took a step forward, the mace heavy and comforting in my grip. "Come a little closer, Jace. I'll show you exactly how soft the bridge of your nose is." "Enough talk," Jace snapped. He signaled the 2 enforcers. "The Alpha wants her head." He didn't say anything about the scavenger. "Kill the man, bring the woman." The 2 enforcers lunged. They were fast, but I had spent years training their kind. I ducked the first one's swing, the momentum of his own weight carrying me past me. I brought the mace up, the heavy stone connecting with his ribs with a sickening crunch. He went down, gasping for air that his lungs could no longer hold. Torin was a blur of motion. He didn't use a weapon, he used his hands. He caught the second enforcer by the throat, the sheer physical strength of his grip lifting the man off his feet. With a grunt of effort, he slammed the warrior into the granite wall. The man slumped, unconscious, before he hit the ground. Jace's eyes widened. He hadn't expected the scavenger to be a mountain of muscle. He reached for a horn at his belt, intending to signal the rest of the pack. "Oh, no, you don't." I lunged, my body screaming in protest, but my aim was true. I tackled him, the 2 of us rolling into the freezing slush. We wrestled in the freezing slush, a mess of limbs and teeth. Jace was stronger than I remembered, his fingers digging into my shoulders, trying to pin me. I bucked, using my hips to throw him off, but a sudden searing pain shot through my abdomen. I gasped, my grip loosening for a split second. Jace saw the opening. He slammed his fist into my side, right where the baby was nestled. I didn't scream. I saw red. I grabbed a handful of snow and ice, shoving it into his eyes, and followed up with a brutal headbutt that sent stars dancing across my vision. Jace fell back, clutching his face, blood streaming from his nose. Torin was over us in an instant, pulling Jace off me and tossing him aside like a rag doll. He knelt in the snow, his hands hovering over me, his expression uncharacteristically panicked. "Kestra, did he—" "I'm fine," I choked out, clutching my side. But I wasn't fine. A warm, terrifying dampness was spreading across my leggings. It wasn't blood from a wound. The sound of a dozen more howls erupted from just down the ridge. The main hunting party had heard the scuffle. They were coming, and they were many. "Torin," I whispered, looking up at him as the first snowflake landed on his scarred cheek. "Something's wrong. The baby, I think it's coming." Chapter 5. The Weight of the Mountain. The dampness spreading down my thigh was a cold realization that hit harder than Jace's fist. It wasn't the copper scent of blood, it was the clear fluid of a life that was refusing to wait for a better time to be born. My body had decided that if the world was going to end today, it was going to end with a beginning. "It's too early," I whispered, my voice cracking as a fresh wave of agony rippled through my midsection. This wasn't the dull ache of the rejection sickness. This was my muscles seizing, tightening into an iron knot that threatened to snap my spine. Torin didn't waste time with platitudes. He looked to the tree line where the shadows were thickening with the arrival of Mordred's elite guard, then back at me. He scooped me up into his arms, ignoring my half-hearted protest as I clutched the heavy mace to my chest. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of my panic. "Jace's blood has signaled every predator within 5 miles. If we stay, they'll pin us in this hole and smoke us out like rats." "I can't run, Torin," I gasped, burying my face in the fur of his collar. The scent of him, leather and salt, was the only thing keeping me from screaming as another contraction rolled over me. "The child, it's pushing." "Then we climb." He didn't head back towards the valleys. He turned toward the dragon's spine, a jagged, vertical ascent of black rock that even the most seasoned trackers avoided in the winter.
It was a suicide mission for most, but Torin moved with the desperate, sure-footed strength of a man who had already died once and had nothing left to fear. Behind us, the howls reached a peak pitch. Mordred's voice joined them, not a howl but a command, amplified by the natural acoustics of the canyon. "Bring me the traitor, leave the scavenger for the crows."
Torin ignored them. He wedged me into a narrow crevice halfway up the first cliff face, using his own body as a physical barrier against the wind. He was breathing hard now, his chest heaving against mine. In the cramped, vertical space, the intimacy was stifling. His hands were everywhere, bracing my hips, steadying my shoulders, keeping me from slipping into the abyss below. "Why?" I managed to choke out between the waves of pain. "You could leave me. You could be 3 ridges away by dawn." Torin leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. For a moment, the world of hunters and betrayals vanished. There was only the heat of his skin and the flint-gray intensity of his eyes. "I spent 10 years alone in these mountains, Kestra. I forgot what it felt like to have a heartbeat next to mine that didn't belong to something I was trying to kill." He touched my cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear I hadn't realized I'd shed. "I'm not losing that now. Not for Mordred, and not for the mountain." The rock beneath us shuddered. A heavy thud sounded from just below our ledge. One of Mordred's trackers, a brute named Garm, had made the jump. He was a massive wolf, even in human form, and he was staring up at us with a sadistic grin, his fingers digging into the stone as he began to climb. "Stay," Torin commanded, his voice dropping an octave into a predatory growl. He let go of the ledge, dropping 5 feet down to meet Garm head-on. Chapter 6. Skin and Stone. I watched from my narrow perch, my fingers trembling as I gripped the cold granite. Below me, the struggle was silent and brutal. There were no flashy displays, no magical bursts, just the raw, terrifying sound of bone hitting bone and the labored breathing of 2 men fighting for dominance on a ledge barely wider than a banquet table. Garm was a brawler, but Torin was a survivor. Every time Garm tried to use his weight to shove Torin off the edge, Torin redirected the force, using the mountain itself as a weapon. He slammed Garm's head into an outcrop, the sound echoing like a hammer on an anvil. I wanted to jump down. I wanted to fight beside him. But as I tried to shift my weight, a contraction hit that was so violent I nearly bit through my lip to keep from crying out. I slumped against the stone, my vision tunneling. "Not now, little one," I pleaded, my hand pressing against the hard curve of my stomach. "Just a little longer. Give me an hour." The baby didn't care about my tactical timeline. It was a relentless force, an internal tide that was pulling me toward a shore I wasn't ready to reach. Below, Torin delivered the final, crushing blow to Garm's throat. The tracker slumped, his eyes rolling back as he slid silently off the ledge, disappearing into the white void of the mist below. Torin didn't watch him fall. He scrambled back up to me, his knuckles bloody and his tunic torn. "We have to go higher," he panted, his eyes scanning my face. He knew the tide was coming in. "The High Den. It's an old hermit's cave near the summit. It's defensible." "Torin, I don't think I can make the summit," I whispered. He didn't argue. He turned his back to me. "Get on. Wrap your arms around my neck and don't let go. If you feel a contraction, squeeze me. I can take it." I climbed onto his back, my heavy belly a weight between us. As he began the grueling ascent, I buried my face in his neck. The intimacy was visceral, the way his muscles bunched and shifted under me, the scent of his exertion, the sheer, unyielding heat of him. He was carrying 2 lives up a frozen needle of rock, and he wasn't slowing down. As we climbed, the wind began to scream, stripping the warmth from my skin. I squeezed him, my fingers digging into his traps as another wave of labor tore through me. Torin didn't flinch. He just grunted, his fingers finding purchase in frozen cracks that shouldn't have held. We reached the High Den just as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the world in a bruised purple light. The cave was little more than a slit in the mountain's crown, but it was dry. He laid me down on a pile of old, dusty furs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't rest. He immediately began piling heavy stones at the entrance, narrowing the gap until only one person could squeeze through at a time. "They're coming, Kestra," he said, looking back at me. His face was set in a mask of grim determination. "I can hear their boots on the lower path. There's at least a dozen of them." I tried to sit up, but my body refused. A sharp, stinging pain flared low in my pelvis. I reached down, my hand coming away slick with something warm. "Torin," I gasped, the air leaving my lungs. "The baby, the head. I can feel the head."
Chapter 7. The Final Perimeter. The world narrowed down to the flickering light of a single tallow candle Torin had struck, and the overwhelming rhythmic roar of my own blood. Outside, the blizzard had arrived in earnest, the wind howling through the cracks in the stones like a choir of the damned. "Look at me, Kestra," Torin commanded. He was at my feet now, his large hands steadying my knees. He'd stripped off his heavy outer furs, leaving him in a thin linen shirt that clung to the hard lines of his torso. "Ignore the wind, ignore the dogs outside, just focus on me." "I'm going to kill Mordred," I wheezed, my fingers shredding the old furs beneath me. "I'm going to find him, and I'm going to... Ugh!" The contraction was a physical wall, a mountain moving inside of me. I arched my back, my scream muffled by the roar of the wind. "Save that rage," he said, his voice dropping into that low, carnal register that seemed to soothe my wolf. "Use it to push. You're the fierce one, remember? You've led armies through worse than this." "I've never led a human being out of my own body," I snapped, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat before it was drowned out by another surge of pain. From outside, the sound of stone hitting stone echoed. Mordred's men had reached the summit. "They're here," I whispered, the fear finally piercing through the pain. "Torin, if they get in..." "They won't." He stood up, his height filling the small cave. He picked up a heavy iron-bound staff from the corner, his knuckles white. He looked like a god of the mountain, ancient and immovable. He leaned down, pressing a hard, desperate kiss to my sweat-soaked forehead. "Birth the child, Kestra. I'll handle the rest." He stepped toward the narrow gap in the stones, his back to me. "Torin!" I called, reaching for him. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Don't die," I said, the words feeling heavy and true. "I haven't even told you your cooking is better than Mordred's yet." A small, genuine smile broke through his grim expression. "Stay loud, Kestra. Let them hear the sound of a queen being born." He stepped into the gap just as the first hunter's blade slammed against the rocks. The sounds of the battle began, the dull thud of wood against flesh, the grunts and exertion, and the snarls of men who had forgotten their humanity. I was alone in the back of the cave, the fire of labor reaching its peak. I felt the incredible, stretching pressure of the child crowning. It was an experience of being torn apart and remade at all once. I grabbed the edges of the furs, my knuckles white, and gave everything I had left. The sound of a heavy body slamming against the stone barricade made the cave floor tremble. A hand, a thick, scarred hand, reached through a gap in the rocks, grasping for purchase. It wasn't Torin's. "I see you, little traitor," a voice hissed from the dark. I let out a primal roar, a sound that was half mother and half wolf, as the baby finally began to slide into the world. Chapter 8. The Breach and the Blood Cry. The hand clawing through the rocks was thick-fingered and stained with old grease, Mordred's master-at-arms, Hroth.
I didn't have the luxury of fear. As my body surged with a final agonizing contraction, I grabbed a heavy, jagged piece of flint from the cave floor. With a snarl that felt like it came from the throat of a mountain lion, I slammed the stone down on those questing fingers. Hroth's roar of pain was drowned out by my own scream as the baby finally cleared my body. The sensation was a violent release, an emptying that left me lightheaded and gasping. In the dim tallow light, I reached down, my hands trembling as I pulled the tiny, slick body to my chest. He was warm, so terrifyingly warm. "Breathe," I hissed, my voice a broken whisper. "Breathe for your mother." A small, wet sputter was followed by a sharp, piercing cry that cut through the sounds of the blizzard and the dying groans of men outside. It was the loudest sound I'd ever heard, a declaration of war against the cold. "Kestra!" Torin's voice came from the barricade, strained and breathless. He's here!" I shouted back, my heart swelling with a fierce, protective heat that made the rejection sickness feel like a distant memory. "He's alive!" The stone barrier groaned again. Torin was being pushed back by the sheer numbers. I could hear the rhythmic thud of a shoulder hitting the rocks, a battering ram of flesh and bone. I didn't have time to recover. I didn't have time to be a mother. I had to be the commander one last time. I wrapped the baby in a dry section of the fur cloak, tying him securely to my chest with a strip of leather. The proximity of his heartbeat against mine was the only drug I needed. My body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder, but the adrenaline was a cold, hard fire in my veins. "Torin, move!" I yelled, grabbing the iron-bound staff he'd dropped earlier. The barrier finally gave way. Hroth stumbled through, his face a mask of rage, his mangled hand dripping blood onto the cave floor. He looked at me, then at the bundle on my chest, and a cruel, twisted grin split his face. "Mordred will pay well for that little scrap," he panted, leveling a heavy club at my head. "You'll have to find your head first," I said, my voice as cold as the ice outside. I didn't wait for him to swing. I used the staff to sweep his legs out from under him. As he fell, I stepped over him, my movement fluid, despite the ache in my pelvis. I didn't kill him. I didn't have the energy for a prolonged fight. I simply slammed the butt of the staff into the back of his neck, sending him into a deep, dark sleep. I reached the gap in the rocks, just as Torin was being forced to one knee by two other trackers. He was covered in blood. Most of it wasn't his, but a deep gash on his shoulder was steaming in the cold air. "Get up!" I roared, the sound echoing off the mountain peaks. Torin looked up, and for a second, the flint in his eyes turned to molten silver. He saw me standing there, the baby strapped to my heart, a staff in my hand, and he found a second wind that shouldn't have been possible. He lunged upward, his shoulder catching the nearest tracker in the gut, sending the man flying backward into the snow. Chapter 9: The Descent of Shadows. The ledge was a slaughterhouse. 3 men lay broken in the snow, their breath hitching in the sub-zero air. Mordred had sent his best, but they hadn't accounted for a woman with everything to lose and a man with nothing but her to keep him alive. "The rest are regrouping at the lower switchback," Torin panted, his hand gripping my arm to steady me. He looked at the bundle on my chest, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before the warrior returned. "We can't stay. They'll bring archers once the wind dies down." "Then we go over the top," I said, looking up at the jagged crown of the dragon's spine. "The descent on the northern side is a vertical drop, but it leads to the Whispering Vale. Mordred won't follow us there. He thinks the Vale is cursed." "It's not cursed," Torin muttered, pulling his cloak tighter around both of us, shielding the baby from the biting wind. "Come on." We began the trek across the summit. Every step was a battle. My body was screaming, a dull, thumping ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. But the tiny weight against my chest was a constant reminder of why I couldn't stop. Torin stayed close, his body positioned between me and the wind, his hand never leaving the small of my back.
The intimacy out here, in the death zone of the mountain, was different. It wasn't about heat anymore. It was about the absolute synchronization of two souls. We moved as one, our breathing falling into the same ragged rhythm. "You're doing well, Kestra," he whispered as we reached the northern edge, just a little further. "Don't patronize me, Torin," I hissed, though I leaned into him. "I've led winter marches through the iron tundra. I can handle a little hill." "A little hill?" He looked down the sheer 500-foot drop into the mist-shrouded valley below. "Remind me never to go hiking with you for fun." We found the hidden path, a series of narrow toeholds and ancient frozen roots. Torin went first, guiding my feet with his hands. The physical contact was the only thing keeping me grounded as the world spun. I could feel the baby shifting against me, a small, restless warmth that gave me the strength to grip the ice-covered rock until my knuckles bled. Halfway down, the wind suddenly died. The silence was more terrifying than the roar. "They've stopped howling," I whispered, glancing back toward the summit. "That's because they've found a better way down," Torin replied, his eyes fixed on the tree line far below. A single high-pitched whistle echoed from the valley floor. It wasn't a wolf, it was a signal. Mordred hadn't just sent his trackers up the mountain, he had sent a second detachment to wait in the only place we could possibly escape to. We weren't fleeing into a sanctuary, we were climbing directly into a trap.
Chapter 10. The Whispering Trap. We hit the valley floor just as the first light of dawn began to bleed across the sky, a pale, sickly yellow that did nothing to warm the bones. The Whispering Vale was thick with ancient oaks, their branches draped in heavy, gray moss that muffled every sound. "Keep the baby quiet," Torin warned, his hand going to the hilt of a knife he'd pulled from a fallen tracker. "He's a wolf of the Iron Claw," I whispered, though I knew the name was a lie now. "He knows when to hold his breath." We moved through the fog, the ground soft with centuries of leaf mold. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and every time the baby moved, a fresh wave of exhaustion threatened to pull me under. We needed a place to hide, a place to tend to our wounds, but the forest felt alive with eyes. "There," Torin pointed toward a dense thicket of brambles and fallen logs. We crawled into the hollow of a massive rotted cedar. It was cramped and smelled of damp earth, but it was hidden. Torin pulled me into his lap, his large arms encircling me and the child. He began to check my side, his fingers gentle as they moved over the bruises and the cooling dampness of my clothes. "You're still bleeding," he murmured, his face inches from mine. The intensity in his gaze was enough to make my heart skip a beat. "We need to get you warm, Kestra, properly warm." "I'm fine," I said, though my voice was a mere ghost of itself. I reached down and carefully unwrapped the cloak to look at my son. He was beautiful. He had Mordred's dark hair, but his eyes, even as they squinted in the dim light, had a fierce, golden clarity that I'd never seen in the Alpha. He looked up at me, his tiny hand reaching out to grab my finger. In that moment, the rest of the world, the hunt, the betrayal, the mountain, simply ceased to exist.
"He looks like you," Torin said, his voice soft. He reached out, his finger hovering over the baby's cheek before he gathered the courage to touch him. The intimacy of the moment was shattered by a low, rhythmic thud. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the sound of a heavy, iron-shod staff hitting the ground in a steady, taunting beat. "Kestra." The voice was like a knife through the fog. "I know you're tired. I know the boy is hungry. Why make him suffer in the dirt?" Mordred. He hadn't stayed at the Great Stone Ring. He hadn't sent his men to do his dirty work. He had come himself. And he wasn't alone. I could hear the rustle of at least 20 warriors moving into a flanking position around our hollow. "He's here for the child," I whispered, my grip tightening on my son. Torin stood up, his height forcing him to hunch in the hollow. He looked at me, then at the baby, and then back at the entrance. "I'll draw them off," Torin said, his voice devoid of doubt. "When I move, you run toward the northern creek. Follow the water until you reach the standing stones. I'll find you there." "Torin, no! There are too many." "They don't want me, Kestra. They want the heir." He leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that tasted of salt and the end of the world. "If I don't make it, tell him his father was the man who kept him warm on the mountain." Before I could protest, Torin burst from the hollow, a roar of pure animalistic defiance tearing from his lungs. I sat in the dark, clutching my son, listening to the sounds of the man I loved throwing himself into a suicide charge to buy me 10 seconds of life.
Chapter 11. The Northern Creek. The sound of Torin's roar was the only thing that kept my legs from giving out. It was a visceral, bone-deep sound that drew the attention of the circling wolves like iron to a magnet. I heard Mordred shout an order, the sound of steel meeting stone, and the heavy thud of bodies colliding. Every instinct I had, every ounce of the commander that still lived in my marrow, screamed at me to turn back, to stand at his shoulder, to die fighting beside the only man who had ever seen me as a person rather than a prize. But the bundle against my chest let out a soft, tiny huff of breath, and I remembered my new command. I scrambled out of the rotted cedar, staying low to the ground. The fog was my only ally, thick and cloying as it clung to the mossy floor of the whispering vale. I moved with a ghost's grace, my boots making no sound on the damp leaf mold. Behind me, the chaos of the fight was a cacophony of snarls and the heavy, rhythmic beat of Mordred's staff. "Find her!" Mordred's voice boomed, closer than I liked. "The scavenger is a distraction. Get the girl." I hit the creek line within minutes. The water was black and fast, churning over jagged rocks that looked like broken teeth. My body was a map of pain. My pelvis felt like it had been shattered, and a cold, sticky sweat was beginning to chill my skin. But the sight of the water gave me a glimmer of hope. Water masked scent. I stepped into the flow. The cold was so intense, it felt like a physical blow, the sub-zero mountain runoff numbing my feet instantly. I gasped, clutching my son tighter as I began to wade upstream, moving toward the standing stones. Every step was a gamble. If I slipped, the current would take us both. If I stayed in too long, the hypothermia would finish what Mordred started. I looked back once, toward the direction of the hollow. I couldn't see Torin, but I could hear him, a series of guttural, pained grunts, and the sound of something heavy slamming into wood. "He's not a scavenger," I whispered into the dark, my teeth chattering so hard I feared I'd bite my tongue. "He's a king." The creek narrowed as it climbed toward a plateau. I pulled myself out of the water, my leggings frozen and heavy. I was shaking so violently that I had to lean against a tree to keep from falling. I unwrapped the cloak just enough to check the baby. He was dry, tucked into the pocket of heat between my breasts, his eyes wide and dark as he watched the swirling fog. "We're almost there," I lied to him. I looked up. Through the thinning mist, the standing stones rose like jagged fingers against the gray sky. They were ancient, weathered by centuries of wind, and supposedly avoided by any wolf who valued their sanity. To me, they looked like the only fortress left in the world. But as I reached the outer circle, a shadow detached itself from the tallest stone. It wasn't Torin. It was too tall, too lean, and carried the unmistakable, arrogant scent of the Iron Claw. "You always were predictable, Kestra," Jace said, stepping into the light. He had a bandage across his nose from our last encounter, and his eyes were burning with a humiliated spite. "The standing stones? Really? It's the first place any tracker would look." Chapter 12. The Circle of the Ancients. Jace didn't have a weapon, He didn't need one. He was a tracker, but he was also a beta of the first rank, and he knew I was running on nothing but fumes and spite. He looked at the way I was leaning against the stone, the way my hand was protectively cupped over the bundle on my chest. A graveyard. Mordred is going to have a good laugh before he takes that pup and puts you in the ground. If you're going to talk me to death, Jace, keep going, I rasped, my hand sliding down to the stone-headed mace still tucked into my belt. Otherwise, get out of my way before I find out if your skull is harder than this rock. He lunged. It wasn't a tactical move. It was a move of pure, petty aggression. I swung the mace, but my timing was off. The weight of the baby shifted my balance, and Jace caught my wrist, twisting it until the mace fell into the snow. He slammed me against the ancient stone, the cold of the rock seeping into my spine. "Give me the brat," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Maybe I'll tell Mordred you died in the river. Maybe I'll save you the pain of watching him drown it." I didn't think. I didn't strategize. I simply brought my knee up into his groin with every bit of strength I had left. As he doubled over, gasping, I drove my forehead into his face, shattering his already broken nose for the second time in 24 hours. He fell back, howling in pain, and I didn't wait. I ran into the center of the standing stones. The air inside the circle was different, still, heavy, and strangely warm. The wind didn't reach here. I collapsed at the base of the central altar, my breath coming in jagged sobs. I was done. My legs wouldn't move, and the darkness was starting to nibble at the edges of my vision. "Kestra!" The voice came from the edge of the circle. I looked up, expecting Mordred, but it was Torin. He was staggering, his clothes shredded, blood matted in his hair and beard. He looked like he'd crawled out of the mouth of hell itself. He fell to his knees a few feet away from me, his chest heaving. "Torin," I breathed, reaching out a hand. He crawled toward me, his movements slow and pained. He reached out, his bloody fingers brushing my face, then the baby's head. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his forehead dropping onto my shoulder. "I thought," he started, his voice cracking, "I thought I'd lost you." "You don't get rid of me that easily," I whispered, pulling him closer. The intimacy of our shared exhaustion was overwhelming, the scent of blood and sweat and survival. For a moment, we were the only 3 people in the world. The moment was shattered by the sound of 20 wolves hitting the perimeter of the circle. They didn't enter. They stopped at the edge of the stones, their hackles raised, their eyes fixed at the center. Mordred stepped through the gap between 2 stones. He looked at us, 2 broken outcasts huddling over a child in the dirt, and he didn't look triumphant. He looked disgusted. "The standing stones," Mordred said, his voice echoing with an unnatural clarity. "Do you know why my people stay away from this place, Kestra?" I didn't answer. I just held Torin and my son. "It's not because of ghosts," Mordred said, stepping into the circle. "It's because there is no escape. The cliff behind you is a 1,000-foot drop. The only way out is through me." Chapter 13. The Alpha's Final Offer. Mordred walked towards us with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew the game was over. He didn't look at Torin. He looked only at me, and then at the bundle on my chest. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, greed perhaps, or a twisted form of pride, passing through his expression. "I'll make you a deal, Kestra," Mordred said, stopping 5 feet away. The wind began to pick up outside the circle, but inside the air remained unnervingly still. "I'll give you a deal, Kestra," Mordred said, stopping 5 feet away. The wind began to pick up outside the circle, but inside the air remained unnervingly still. "Give me the boy. He is my blood. He belongs to the Iron Claw. You give him to me, and I'll let the scavenger live. I'll even let you go. You can spend the rest of your days wandering the heaths like the animal you've become." Torin tried to stand, a growl building in his throat, but I pressed a hand to his chest, holding him back. I looked up at Mordred, the man I had once thought I loved. He looked so small now, so insignificant compared to the man bleeding beside me.
You think I'd give him to you? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. So you can teach him to break bonds? So you can teach him that dirt is more valuable than heart? I'll teach him how to rule, Mordred snapped, something you clearly forgot. You chose a lone wolf over a pack. You chose a mistake over a throne. I chose a father over an alpha, I countered. Mordred's face contorted. He raised his staff, the heavy wood whistling through the air. Then you chose death, all of you. He signaled his men. They didn't move. They stood at the edge of the stones, their eyes darting nervously toward the central altar where we sat.
"What are you waiting for?" Mordred roared. "Kill them!" "They won't enter, Mordred," Torin rasped, his eyes fixed on the ground beneath us. "Look at the snow." I looked down, where our blood had dripped into the earth, mine from the birth, Torin's from the fight. The snow wasn't melting. It was turning black, a deep obsidian black that was spreading outward in rhythmic pulses, like a heartbeat. The standing stones weren't a graveyard. They were an altar, and we had just given them exactly what they had been waiting for: the blood of a rejected mate, the blood of a protector, and the first cry of a new alpha. The ground began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. Mordred took a step back, his eyes widening as the blackness reached his boots. "What is this?" he hissed. "It's the mountain, Mordred," I said, a strange, calm power washing over me as I felt the earth connect with the void in my chest where the bond had been. "And it doesn't like you." A massive crack split the earth directly between Mordred and us, a roar, not of a wolf, but of shifting stone and ancient cower erupted from the depths. The cliff edge behind us didn't crumble, it opened. Chapter 14. The Maw of the Mountain. The sound of the earth splitting was a deafening groan, a tectonic protest that drowned out Mordred's panicked orders. The fissure didn't just divide the ground, it swallowed the very air, creating a vacuum that pulled the freezing mist into the depths. Mordred scrambled backward, his heavy boots skidding on the obsidian-stained snow as the crack raced to the perimeter of the standing stones. "Fall back!" Mordred screamed, his voice finally losing its practiced edge of authority. "The plateau is collapsing!" But it wasn't a collapse. It was an invitation. Torin gripped my arm, his fingers digging into my skin with a strength that grounded me even as the world shook. He wasn't looking at Mordred. He was looking at the abyss that had opened behind us, a smooth, sloping path of ancient stone that led down into the belly of the peak, a way that hadn't existed seconds. "The mountain is choosing, Kestra," he grunted, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes burning with a sudden, wild clarity. "We stay and die by his steel, or we trust the dark." I looked at Mordred. He stood on the far side of the growing gap, his face twisted in a mixture of cowardice and greed. He wanted the child, but he was terrified of the ground he stood on. He looked at his warriors, the elite Ironclaw, who were already retreating, their primal instincts telling them that this was no longer a battle between wolves. This was a reckoning with the earth itself. "You're a coward, Mordred," I roared over the thunder of the shifting rock. I clutched my son to my chest, his small, warm weight the only thing that felt real. I turned my back on the man I had once served. It was the ultimate insult, the final rejection. I didn't need a ritual to break what was already dead. I stepped toward the edge of the new opening, the black stone beneath my feet feeling strangely warm, vibrating with a resonance that matched the pulse in my own throat. "Kestra, wait!" Mordred's voice was desperate now. He took a step toward the fissure, reaching out a hand. "You won't survive the deeps. Bring the boy back. I'll commute the exile." "Keep your mercy, Alpha," I spat, glancing back one last time. "I have a pack now, and it doesn't include you." Torin took my hand, his palm rough and hot. Together, we stepped off the ledge, sliding into the darkness of the mountain's throat, just as the fissure slammed shut above us, sealing the standing stones in a tomb of silent, unbroken snow. The slide was fast and smooth, the stone beneath us polished by eons of hidden water. We descended into the dark, the roar of the surface world fading into a rhythmic, earthy thrum. I tucked my chin down, shielding my son's head as we plummeted into the heart of the dragon's spine. We came to a gradual halt on a bed of soft, phosphorescent moss. It wasn't magic, just the bioluminescent growth of the deep veins, casting a dim emerald glow over a vast, subterranean cathedral of quartz and iron. Torin rolled off the slide first, reaching out to catch me as I tumbled onto the moss. We lay there for a long moment, the silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Are you whole?" Torin whispered, his voice echoing off the crystalline walls. I checked the bundle. My son was wide awake, his golden eyes reflecting the soft green light, his tiny mouth open in a silent yawn. He wasn't crying. He looked like he had finally come home. "We're whole," I breathed, the exhaustion finally crashing over me like a tidal wave. But as Torin tried to sit up, he let out a choked gasp, his hand flying to his side. In the dim light, I saw the dark stains spreading across the moss. Mordred hadn't missed with his staff. A jagged splinter of iron-hard wood was buried deep in Torin's flank. Chapter 15. The Heart of the Iron. "Don't you dare," I hissed, crawling toward him. My body felt like it was held together by nothing but sheer willpower and dried blood. "Don't you dare die on me now, Torin. I didn't climb a mountain and birth a king just to watch you bleed out on a pile of moss." Torin leaned back against a pillar of raw quartz, his breathing shallow and hitched. The wound was bad, deep, jagged, and oozing the kind of dark blood that meant internal damage. He looked at me, a weak, lopsided smile touching his scarred lips. "I told you, I'm a ghost, Kestra," he rasped, his eyes fluttering. "Ghosts don't stay. They just pass through." "Not this one," I snapped. I laid my son down on a soft patch of moss beside us, the baby watching us with an unnerving, ancient calm. I grabbed the front of Torin's shirt, pulling him forward so I could see the wound. "You're the only man I've ever met who didn't try to break me. You don't get to leave me to do this alone." I reached for the splinter. It was a piece of Mordred's authority literally embedded in the man who had replaced him. I knew if I pulled it, he might bleed out in minutes. If I left it, the infection would take him by dawn. There was no medicine here, no healers, only the raw physical strength of our bodies and the heat of our blood. "Kestra, look," Torin whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward the center of the cavern. I followed his gaze. In the middle of the chamber, a spring of dark, iron-rich water bubbled up from the floor, flowing into a shallow basin of black stone. It wasn't magical water, it was a mineral spring, heated by the mountain's core. The scent was sharp, metallic, and heavy with the smell of life. I looked back at Torin. "I have to move you." I can't feel my legs, little wolf." "Then I'll be your legs." I stood up, the pain in my pelvis flaring into a white-hot scream, but I ignored it. I grabbed Torin under his arms, my muscles bunching as I took his massive weight. I dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, across the moss. My own blood trailed behind us, mixing with his. It was a brutal, visceral labor of a different kind. We reached the edge of the basin. I rolled him into the warm, mineral-thick water. He let out a low groan as the heat hit his skin. I stepped in after him, the warmth soaking into my frozen leggings, soothing the raw aches of the birth. I gripped the splinter in his side. "On 3, Torin. 1, 2. I pulled on 2. Torin's roar of agony shook the quartz pillars, a raw, masculine sound that's filled the cavern. I slammed my hand over the wound, feeling the hot rush of his life trying to escape. I pressed my body against his, using my weight to stem the flow, my face buried in the crook of his neck. "Stay," I commanded, my voice vibrating against his skin. "Stay with us." We sat in the dark, hot water, locked together in a desperate embrace. The heat of the spring, the heat of our bodies, and the scent of iron filled the air. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Slowly, the frantic pounding of his heart began to steady. The bleeding slowed, the minerals in the water acting as a natural styptic. He shifted, his hand coming up to rest on the back of my head, his fingers tangled in my matted hair. "I'm still here," he whispered, his voice stronger. I pulled back, looking into his eyes. The flint was back, tempered by a softness that was reserved only for me. I leaned in, our lips meeting in a kiss that wasn't about passion or heat. It was about the absolute, terrifying relief of survival. But the silence of the cavern was broken by a soft, rhythmic scratching. It wasn't coming from the entrance we had used. It was coming from the walls. Chapter 16. The Guardians of the Deep. I froze, my hand still resting on Torin's chest. The scratching was joined by a low, clicking sound, the sound of claws on stone. In the dim green light, I saw movement in the shadows of the quartz pillars. Not wolves, not humans. Something else lived in the deeps. "Torin," I breathed, reaching for the mace I'd dropped by the moss. He followed my gaze, his body tensing in the water. He tried to stand, but I pushed him back down. "You're still knitting. Stay in the water." I stepped out of the basin, my movements stiff but certain. I picked up the mace and scooped my son back into my arms, the baby remaining unnervingly silent as he looked toward the shadows. A dozen figures emerged from the dark. They were small, lithe, and covered in thick, pale fur. They had the faces of foxes, but the upright posture of men, their eyes huge and unblinking in the low light. They didn't carry weapons. They carried bundles of dried herbs and bowls of dark clay. "The Deepkin," Torin whispered, his voice filled with awe. "The legend said they vanished before the first Alpha ever claimed a pack." One of the creatures stepped forward, its head tilting as it looked at me, then at the baby, and finally at the basin where Torin lay. It let out a soft, trilling sound. "They aren't here to fight," I realized, the tension in my shoulders easing just a fraction. The creature held out a bowl of the clay, gesturing toward Torin's wound. I hesitated for a heartbeat, my eyes searching the creature's face. I saw no malice there, only a deep, ancient curiosity. I nodded. The Deepkin moved with a blurred speed, several of them surrounding the basin. They began to apply the clay to Torin's side, their small hands moving with practiced efficiency. Another creature approached me, holding out a bundle of soft woven lichen, a wrap for the baby. I let them help. I had spent my whole life fighting for every inch of ground, every scrap of respect. For the first time, I allowed the world to give something back. As they worked, the leader of the creatures looked at me and pointed toward the far wall of the cavern. A massive, arched tunnel had been carved into the quartz, leading further north, away from Mordred, away from the Ironclaw, and toward a land where the maps ended. "The Whispering Veil isn't a trap," I said, looking back at Torin. "It's a gatehouse." Torin stood up, the clay already hardening over his wound. He looked stronger, the mineral water and the kin's medicine working a miracle of the deep. He stepped out of the water and walked to me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "We go north?" he asked. "We go where he can grow up without ever hearing the word Alpha," I replied, looking down at my son. We began the walk toward the tunnel, the Deepkin escorting us like a silent honor guard. But as we reached the threshold of the new path, a sound echoed from the slide we had used to enter the cavern. A heavy, metallic clap. I turned. At the very top of the slide, a single figure stood silhouetted against a sliver of moonlight from above. It wasn't Mordred. It was a scout. One of my own former warriors, a girl named Mara, who I had trained since she was a pup. She was looking down into the green-lit cavern, her eyes wide as she took in the scene, the outcasts, the child, and the ancient creatures. She held a signaling horn in her hand. One blow, and Mordred would know exactly where we were. One blow, and the mountain's secret would be out. Mara looked at me, her hand trembling on the horn. She looked at the baby in my arms. Then, slowly, she raised the horn to her lips. Chapter 17. The Silence of the Scout. The air in the cavern curdled. Mara's fingers were white as they gripped the brass of the signaling horn. Her eyes locked onto mine from the top of the stone slide. One breath, that was all it would take to bring the full weight of Mordred's desperation down into this sanctuary. I didn't reach for my mace. I didn't growl. I simply stood my ground, clutching my son to my chest, and stared at the girl I had taught to track by the scent of pine and the shift of the wind. "Mara," I said, my voice carrying through the quartz pillars with a steady, quiet authority. "You remember the landslide at the southern border, when the earth moved and the pack was ready to leave you for the crows?" The horn wavered at her lips, her chest hitched, the cold air above meeting the warmth of the deeps in a frantic cloud of mist. "I remember," she whispered, the sound barely a ghost in the vast chamber. "I didn't leave you because a warrior isn't a tool to be discarded when it breaks," I said, taking a step toward the center of the cavern, letting the green light illuminate my son's face. "Mordred thinks differently. He thinks this child is a weapon. He thinks Torin is trash. He thinks you are replaceable." Torin moved to my side, his presence a silent, looming threat, but he didn't attack. He watched her with the weary patience of a man who had seen too many good people die for bad alphas. Mara looked at the Deepkin, who were watching her with their large, unblinking eyes. She looked at the blood on the moss, and then at the fierce, unbroken line of my shoulders. The struggle was written in the twitch of her jaw, the pull of the pack bond versus the truth of her own eyes. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered the horn. "He's coming, Kestra," she called down, her voice trembling. "He's lost his mind. He's calling for a blood hunt. He's telling the pack the mountain has stolen his heir, and he'll tear the peaks down to get him back. Let him try. But you go back. Tell him the slide collapsed. Tell him you found nothing but stone and shadow." Mara looked at me for a final long moment, a final salute passing between us in the silence. "He won't believe me for long. You need to go. Fast." She turned and vanished from the opening, the sound of her boots retreating into the night. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my knees momentarily turning to water. Torin caught me, his hands steady on my waist. "She's right," he said, his eyes turning toward the northern tunnel. "The horn didn't blow, but the scent of blood is a trail even a pup could follow eventually. We have to move before he finds another way down." The Deepkin trilled in agreement, their lithe bodies already fading into the shadows of the quartz path, beckoning us to follow. We didn't look back. We stepped into the northern tunnel, leaving the cathedral of light behind for the narrow, winding veins of the world's roots. We walked for hours, the temperature rising as we went, deeper. The intimacy of the dark was absolute. Every time I stumbled, Torin's hand was there. Every time the baby stirred, Torin leaned in to share his heat. We weren't just fleeing, we were being forged. The tunnel began to slope upward, the air turning from the smell of iron and damp to the crisp, clean scent of cedar and moving water. "We're near the surface," Torin whispered, his hand going to the hilt of his blade. The tunnel ended abruptly at a wall of thick, tangled roots. I pushed through them, the morning sun hitting my eyes with a blinding brilliance. I stepped out onto a ledge and gasped. We weren't in the heaths anymore. Below us stretched a valley of emerald green, untouched by the winter snows of the peaks, hidden behind a permanent veil of mist. "The hidden reach," Torin breathed, stepping out beside me. But as we looked down into the paradise we had bled to find, a shadow crossed the sun. A massive, dark shape plummeted from the cliffs above, hitting the ledge with the force of a falling star. Mordred stood there, his fur cape gone, his shirt stained with the blood of his own men. He hadn't followed the slide. He had scaled the exterior of the dragon's spine in the dead of night, driven by a madness that had stripped away the last of his humanity.
Chapter 18. The Alpha's Madness. Mordred didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a beast. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and stretched tight over his cheekbones. He held his iron-shod staff like a club, the metal end dented and smeared with gore. He didn't look at Torin. He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed entirely on the bundle at my chest. Mine, he rasped, the word a wet, guttural sound in his throat. That is the blood of the Iron Claw. That is my seat on the high throne. Give him to me, Kestra, and I might let you die quickly. You really don't get it, do you? I said, stepping in front of Torin, who was already shifting his weight to protect his wounded side. The pack is gone, Mordred. Mara didn't follow you. None of them did. You're alone. I am the Alpha, he roared, the sound echoing off the cliffs and sending a flock of white birds screaming into the sky. I am the pack. As long as I breathe, the law is mine. He lunged. He was fast, faster than any man I'd ever seen, but he was sloppy. He was fighting with rage, not technique. I dodged the first swing of the staff, the iron whistling inches from my son's head. I didn't have a weapon, but I had the ledge. Torin intercepted him before he could swing again. The two men collided with a sickening thud of muscle on muscle. Torin was taller, but Mordred was fueled by a manic, adrenaline-soaked strength. They grappled at the edge of the drop, their boots kicking up dust and loose shale. "Torin, no!" I screamed, trying to find an opening, but the ledge was too narrow. I couldn't risk swinging the mace with the baby strapped to me. Mordred drove his knee into Torin's wounded flank. Torin choked a cry, his grip loosening. Mordred seized the advantage, slamming the butt of his staff into Torin's temple. Torin slumped, his eyes rolling back as he fell against the rock wall. Mordred turned to me, a predatory grin twisting his face. He dropped the staff, his fingers curling into claws. "Now, Kestra, let's end this little rebellion." I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached the very edge of the ledge. Below me was a 300-foot drop into the mist of the valley. To my left was the tunnel we had just exited. To my right, a sheer wall of granite. "You won't kill me," I said, my voice shaking but my eyes fixed on his. "You need me to nurse him. You need me to keep him alive." "I need the blood," said Mordred, stepping closer. "I'll find a wet nurse in the southern tribes. You're just the vessel, Kestra, and the vessel is cracked." He lunged for the baby. I didn't move away. I moved in. I used his own momentum against him, grabbing his arm and spinning, my hip catching his center of gravity. It was the same move I'd taught the recruits for years, but Mordred was too heavy, too strong. He caught himself, his hand wrapping around my throat, pinning me against the edge of the abyss. His grip tightened. The world began to blur. I looked into his eyes and saw nothing but the cold, dead hunger for power. "Goodbye, Kestra," he whispered. A sudden, sharp cry erupted from the bundle on my chest. My son's voice, piercing and clear, rang out across the ledge. Mordred flinched. For a fraction of a second, his grip loosened as he looked down at the child. It was the only opening I needed. I didn't use a fist. I used my teeth. I leaned forward and sank my teeth into his ear, tearing downward with every bit of primal rage I possessed. Mordred screamed, his hands flying to his head. I kicked out with both feet, pushing off his chest with the strength of a mother who had just seen the end of the world. Chapter 19. The Fall of Iron. Mordred stumbled back, his hands clutching his bleeding head, his boots dancing on the edge of shale. He looked at me, a moment of pure, lucid terror crossing his face as he realized where he was standing. He didn't fall immediately. He teetered there, the wind whipping his hair around his face. "Kestra!" he gasped, reaching out a hand. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. I stood there, breathing hard, clutching my son to my heart. I looked at the man who had been my mate, my leader, and my tormentor. I saw the weakness behind the mask of the Alpha. "The mountain chose, Mordred," I said, my voice cold and final. "And it didn't choose you." The ledge gave way. There was no scream, just the sound of sliding rock and a heavy silence as the mist swallowed him whole. Mordred, the high alpha of the Ironclaw, vanished into the deep green deeps of the hidden reach, leaving behind but the dented iron staff and the scent of bitter copper in the air. I collapsed onto my knees, the adrenaline draining out of me and leaving a hollow, aching void. I crawled over to Torin, who was starting to stir, his hand clutching his head. "Is he—" Torin managed to ask, his voice thick and slurred. "He's gone," I whispered, pulling Torin's head into my lap. "He's gone, Torin. It's over." Torin let out a long, shuddering breath, his body finally relaxing. He reached up, his fingers finding my hand and interlacing with mine. We sat there on the blood-stained ledge as the sun climbed higher, the light finally reaching the valley floor below. The Deepkin emerged from the tunnel behind us, their large eyes taking in the scene. They didn't speak, but their trilling was soft and melodic, a song of healing. They began to help Torin to his feet, their small frames providing a surprising amount of support. We began the final descent into the valley. The hidden reach was even more beautiful from the ground. There were ancient trees with silver leaves, clear streams filled with fish, and a peace that I hadn't known existed in this world. It wasn't a place for a pack, it was a place for a family. We found a small cabin near the waterfall, a relic of the hermit who had once lived here. It was sturdy, warm, and smelled of cedar. Torin sat on the porch, the baby in his arms, while I gathered wood for a fire. "We need a name for him," Torin said, looking down at the golden-eyed child. "Not Mordred," I said, sitting beside him and resting my head on his shoulder, "and not a name from the Ironclaw." "How about Calum?" Torin suggested, "after the mountain that couldn't break us." "Calum," I repeated, the name feeling right on my tongue. Calum of the Reach. We sat in the twilight, the three of us, watching the stars begin to appear over the peaks. The intimacy was quiet now, a steady hum of devotion and safety. I looked at Torin, his scars, his strength, his kindness, and I knew that I had finally found the bond I was meant for. But as the moon rose, a low, rhythmic sound began to echo from the cliffs above. It wasn't a howl, it was the sound of a horn. Mara hadn't just gone back to lie, she had led the others. High on the ridge, I could see the silhouettes of a dozen wolves. They weren't attacking, they were sitting, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the valley below. They weren't Mordred's pack anymore. They were looking for a new one. "They found us," Torin whispered, his hand tightening on mine. I stood up, looking up at the ridge. I wasn't the commander of the Ironclaw. I was the mother of the future. "Let them come," I said, a fierce grin spreading across my face. "But they're going to have to learn a whole new set of rules."
Chapter 20. The Law of the Reach. Torin's hand went to the small of my back, his touch a grounding wire for the lightning still humming in my veins. High above us, the silhouettes on the ridge didn't move. They didn't growl, and they didn't descend like a hunting party. They sat in the silver moonlight, a line of silent sentinels watching the smoke rise from our small stone hearth. "They're not coming for a fight, Kestra," Torin murmured, his voice thick with the gravel of exhaustion. "They're coming for the only alpha left who hasn't tried to bleed them dry." "I'm not an alpha," I snapped, though the heat of the baby against my chest softened the edge of my words. "I'm a woman who wants to sleep for a week, and a mother who wants to make sure her son never sees a brand." I stepped off the porch, my boots crunching on the lush, unfrozen grass of the hidden reach. I looked up at the ridge, my eyes finding the largest shadow, Mara. She stood at the center of the line, the brass horn glinting at her hip. She shifted, her wolf's eyes catching the light, and then slowly she began the descent. The others followed her in a single file, a silent pilgrimage down the jagged black rock. They reached the valley floor as the mist began to swirl around their ankles. 10 warriors, 10 wolves I had bled with, trained with, and ultimately been betrayed by. They stopped 20 paces from the cabin. Mara stepped forward, her head bowed. She didn't offer a salute, she offered her throat, a raw physical gesture of submission that made the air in the valley grow heavy with the scent of old laws. "Mordred is gone," she said, her voice echoing off the waterfall. "The flint stone is fractured. The elders want to crown a pup of the southern line, but we didn't go back to the stone ring. We followed the scent of the high den." "You followed a ghost and a traitor," I said, my hand tightening on Calum's wrapping. "Why?" "Because the ghost protected the mother, and the traitor saved the future." Mara looked up, her eyes landing on the bundle in my arms. "We don't want a throne, Kestra. We want a pack that doesn't eat its own." I looked at Torin. He was leaning against the porch post, his face scarred and weary, but his eyes were fixed on me with an absolute, unwavering devotion. He wasn't waiting for me to lead, he was waiting for me to choose. "There are no alphas here," I said, my voice ringing out through the valley. "There is no stone ring. If you stay in the reach, you work the soil, you hunt for the collective, and you protect the weak. You don't bow to me, and you don't bow to my son." One by one, the warriors dropped to their knees. It wasn't the forced submission of Mordred's reign, it was the quiet, desperate relief of the found. Torin walked over to me, his presence a warm shield against the night air. He wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me into his side. I leaned into him, the scent of cedar and wood smoke finally replacing the bitter copper of the mountain. "A pack of outcasts," Torin whispered in my hair, his lips brushing my temple. "It has a certain ring to it." "It has the ring of a lot of work," I muttered, but I couldn't hide the small, fierce smile that touched my lips. The moon reached its zenith, bathing the hidden reach in a light that felt like a benediction. I looked down at Calum, who was fast asleep, his tiny fist curled around a lock of Torin's hair. We weren't just survivors anymore, we were the beginning of something that the history books wouldn't know how to name. We walked back toward the cabin, the new pack settling into the shadows of the silver-leafed trees. As Torin opened the door, he paused, looking at me with an intensity that made the breath catch in my throat. "I promised you a pack," he said, his voice dropping to a low, carnal rumble. "I just didn't think it would happen before we had our first dinner." "We'll survive it," I said, pulling him into the warmth of our new home. "We survived the mountain. The rest is just details." I closed the door on the old world, the sound of the waterfall drowning out the echoes of the Flintstone forever. The seasons in the Hidden Reach did not follow the cruel dictates of the northern peaks. Here, the air stayed sweet with the scent of crushed herbs and mountain spring water, a permanent sanctuary carved out of the world's ribcage. 5 winters had passed since the stones of the dragon spine had swallowed Mordred's reign. I stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching the morning mist burn off the silver-leafed forest. My body felt different now, stronger, anchored by a peace that once felt like a fairy tale. The scars from the exile remained, silver lines across my skin, but they no longer ached with the memory of rejection. "He's trying to track the deepkin again," a voice rumbled behind me.
I didn't need to turn to feel the heat radiating from Torin. He stepped up behind me, his massive chest a solid wall against my back. He wrapped his arms around my waist, his hands, still scarred, still powerful, resting over my stomach. The intimacy between us had only deepened with the years. It was no longer a desperate huddle against the cold, but a slow burning fire that fueled everything we built.
He won't catch them, I said, leaning my head back against his shoulder. They've been teaching him to hide, not how to hunt. In the distance, a small, dark-haired blur erupted from the tall grass. Calum, now 5 years old and possessing eyes the color of molten gold, was sprinting toward the creek. He wasn't running like a soldier. He was running with the joyous, reckless abandon of a child who had never known a master. Behind him, Mara and 2 other guardians followed at a respectful distance. They weren't a vanguard anymore. They were a family. The pack of the Reach had grown to 30 souls, all outcasts, all survivors who'd traded their brands for the right to breathe. "He has your temper, Kestra," Torin whispered, his lips brushing the sensitive skin of my neck, "and my inability to stay in one place." I corrected, turning in his arms. I looked into Torin's eyes. The flint was still there, but it was bright with a quiet, carnal devotion. We didn't need a mate bond recognized by an alpha. We had the bond of blood, bone, and the mountain that had chosen us. Torin picked me up, my legs instinctively hooking around his waist as he carried me back toward the shadows of the cabin. The world outside the Reach could keep its crowns and its wars. Here, in the heart of the deeps, the only law was the heat of our skin and the steady, unbreakable rhythm of a pack built on choice. The Alpha's exile had ended. The Queen's reign had begun, not with a throne, but with a home.
And that concludes our gripping journey through the lands of the severed bond. What an incredible tale of defiance, survival, and the fierce heart of a mother. If Kestra and Torin's story captured your imagination, don't let the adventure end here. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our growing pack for more intense, unforgettable shifter romances. And tell us in the comments, what was your favorite moment from Kestra's fight for her son? Catch the next thrilling saga right here on Z's Romance.